Solomon was the original author. Now, in that perspective, I believe that it wasn't actually Solomon who literally wrote the text, but his scribe, because in the palaces and things back then, the scribes would record everything that the kings would say to their guests and things. So my perspective is more based on a view that the scribe has recorded this grand speech to all of Solomon's guests, and have basically recorded it in a way that gives glory to God and a way that brings unity. Some people who believe that Solomon wrote the book as well have said, well, he wrote it in the time of his life where he was just reflecting on his past. He was old and run down, and he was just repentant of everything that he had done, all of his sins, and that basically he was writing it in a time where he was just really trying to pull life back together. But nowhere in the Bible does it suggest that Solomon was ever repentant of the actual sins that he committed, especially with having so many wives and so many concubines and that sort of thing. There's nowhere in the Bible that actually says that. So I believe that Solomon actually wrote this at the prime of his life. Okay, Solomon was only 12 when he came to the throne. That's so young. And he was given this promise that basically God asked him, is there something that I can help you with to run this country, basically? And Solomon, he could have asked for anything, but he asked for wisdom, and God blessed him in that. So by the time if he started on the throne at 12 years old, by the time he was 35, he could have very well had a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience. He would have seen a lot of things. He would have had so many visitors worldwide coming through his doors. If you think about who would have sat at his table, he had a vast audience every day. From his 700 wives, but just one that he loved, 300 concubines, one son and 2 daughters. Every day, his family and the chief officials and the governors, and that would sit down at his table. That's over 1,000 people every day. Not to mention the kings, the wise people that came, the queens, and just everyday people that wanted their issues resolved. They were all coming to him. And so he had an audience a lot of the time. He was the wisest man on earth, and everyone came out of the woodworks to receive either his wisdom or a bride price. So now Solomon had become king. And in 1 Kings 3, verse 7 to 9, it says, I'm only a little child and I do not know how to carry out my duties. And then he asked for the wisdom. His vocabulary from basically meeting all these people who were coming to him and asking him and to resolve their issues, and all the people that were travelling from far and wide to come and see him, his vocabulary would have been very vast. He would have, as most people do to relate to people in that time, he would have learnt their languages, he would have learnt their familiar terms, he would have learnt their ways, their cultures in those meetings. And so his wisdom in that would have been very vast. So that would account for the foreign words that are used in the writings. Okay, the book is structured in the way that we hear 2 voices. That's why I say that it's written by a scribe, and there's a voice of the main person who's speaking. Sorry, I'm not keeping up with the slides very well. All right, so just for a moment, I want you to just think about the last time that you read the book of Ecclesiastes all the way through. All right, from start to finish, one sweep. When was the last time that you've done that? I challenge you one day to read it as a whole, read it out loud, and read it like it is an actual speech, like you are King Solomon presenting it to his people. You can hear it in the way that it flows, that it's basically his thoughts as he is speaking, going from one thing to the next. He begins with this amazing statement that says, "Vanity, vanity, everything is vanity." Or other translations say meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And the reason why they differ in the English is that the English translation doesn't quite reflect everything that the Hebrew does. In the original Hebrew, the author uses the word hevel, and this is basically translated to mean meaningless vapour, vanity. It has this fleetingness about it, so it's like a quickness, something that is there for a moment and then disappears. This same idea is expressed in Psalm 39, where we read that our lives are but a breath in the space of eternity. From this thought of fleetingness, Solomon then poses the following question: what do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? He then uses some poetic language to describe all that happens under the sun, around and everything that lives under the sun. He says, generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, and it hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows from the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place that the streams come from, they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye has never had enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. Then he concludes with some poetic thoughts that what has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. So Solomon describes this imagery where it reflects this ever-repeating human condition, okay? The generations pass and go, and those generations before have experienced what generations now are experiencing. We all experience this human condition, this finiteness in the created environment around us. Solomon then turns his thoughts towards the wisdom that he's required about the observations of the things that happen under the sun. From wisdom, pleasure and folly and work, he explains all the things that he had pursued. He starts then to speak in another poetic way, telling us a poem about time and all that is experienced within it. In verses 3 to 1, he says, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the sun and the heavens." And then he concludes with Ecclesiastes 3:10 to 11. He says, "I have seen the burden that God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end." So with this statement, he expresses not only are we finite, meaning we're not infinite, we are not God, our human condition is unable to control every element around us. We're not able to control the weather. We're not able to control circumstances around us. We're not able to control our futures. We're not able to comprehend what God has created. There's so much unknown, so much that is out of our control. So we keep reading through and we see that Solomon moves on to discuss how he observed how people use their time that they are given. and how people are affected by the use of their time and by the use of others' time. He states in chapter 5, verse 15, "Everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands." And then he goes on in verse 18, "This is what I have observed to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labour." So here's his logic. He says, we all need to eat, we all need to drink, we all need food and drink to survive. And the way that we get that food and drink is to work for it, right? So why not enjoy that work while you're doing it? It takes these necessary elements of wheat or grapes to create bread and wine. To sustain us, we need food, we need drink to keep us alive. And he says that we should do this glad in heart, for these things are a gift from God. And they are basically the only three things that we have a little bit of control over. Solomon continues his speech with more observations and states in chapter 6, verse 12, "For who knows what is good for a person in life? During the few," and here is where they use that word hevel again, meaningless, vain, fleeting, but a breath of days that pass through like a shadow, who can tell them what has happened under the sun? In this statement, he explains that there is even more unknown in our lives which concerns our future. More things not to have control over. When we leave this earth, we actually have no control over the things that we leave behind. We have no control over the things that other people do. We can't control our children's actions when they're growing up. As much as we invest into them, we actually cannot control their behaviour. They have choice. They make their own decisions. And just the same, we don't have control over anyone else in our lives but ourselves. We are not God. God has ultimate control over the things that our humanness limits us to. So now Solomon related all of his thoughts to things that were relative and familiar. As I mentioned before, he would have had so many people from all over coming to see him, from different countries, from different lands, and using different languages. And in that, he learnt these words and things that were familiar to them and their cultures, so that he could speak to people in a way that they would relate to. Okay, so most people in those times, not just the Israelites, had a god of some kind, whether it was an idol or a Baal or whatever. They had a god of some kind. They would go to a temple or some place of worship to worship this god. And it was strange to them that the Israelites couldn't see their God. Okay? In some of the countries, they had an altar that would be for the unseen God. And that is basically Israel's God. People in those times were under some sort of kingship most of the time. They were under some sort of status. And so in this next section, that's what Solomon raises. He talks about all those things, all those issues that are going on in those countries and those places, just to become relevant to them in that conversation. Then after discussing all these things, he concludes with a thought about the meaning of human life. He says in chapter 8, verse 17, he says, "No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun, despite all their efforts to search it out. No one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim that they know, they cannot really understand it." So up until this point, he's shared with his crowd of listeners that all people basically have a common destiny. All people experience time. All people need to eat and to drink and to work to survive. All people experience having no control. And they experience an unknowingness. From here, Solomon moves to the thought that all people have a common destiny. We all experience death. It's a part of life. My godfather died this week. It's just a part of who we are as humans. We will experience that loss, that grief, and it's life. It ends in death. Whether a person is good or bad, they will eventually die. The difference is that it says that those who are considered bad don't actually think about their end, whereas those who are considered good do think about that eternal perspective. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 2 says, all share in a common destiny, the righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, those who offer sacrifices and those who do not. So, and then he says, this basically reflects on everything that he's spoken to these people about. And then in chapter 9, verse 1, he says, so I reflected on all of this and concluded that the righteous and the wise, it doesn't mention the wicked, doesn't mention the bad, it just says the righteous and the wise, and what they do are all in God's hands. But no one knows whether love or hate awaits them. In that verse, that is the uncontrol. That is the parts that we can't control. We don't know whether love or hate awaits us, whether we are good or bad. In other words, no matter who you are, the unknown can happen to you, okay? Either good or bad unknown can happen to you. But God will hold you through it. So then he goes on to speak directly to those who are considered good. And he commands them in chapter 9, verses 7 to 8. He says, go and eat your food with gladness. And drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved of what you do. Always be clothed in white and anoint your head with oil. In other words, go live a life of purity before God, eat and drink, enjoy your work, and know that when this unknown happens, because it will happen, that God is holding you. Solomon then discusses that with all of this unknown, there's a thing called chance, okay? So he gives a practical suggestion here. This is like a little sideline tip. He's one of the richest men on earth, so he's like, hey, just listen to this tip. He says, be prepared. He says in chapter 11, verse 6, sow your seed in the morning, and then at evening let your hands do not be idle, for you do not know which one will succeed, whether your morning job or your afternoon job will succeed. He's given you, a tip here. Don't sit around and be lazy. Be an entrepreneur. Do something different. Whether this or that, or whether both will do equally well. And then he concludes his grand speech by urging those people through poetic language, to remember their Creator amongst all of this unknown. And then he ends on vanity, vanity, everything is vanity. But his last concluding word of everything is a bit of a command. He said, now that all has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. What a speech. Just consider the depth of the wisdom for a minute. There was just so much in that one speech. This is just one of many that he would have given. Solomon was given the basic principle that being human is to experience the unknown that only God knows. Therefore, fear God, trust him, for this is actually a life worth living. Now, Solomon did not get to experience everything. Obviously, he was human, he died. But the greatest unknown happened after he passed from the earth. The most amazing gift of all came. We all know him. It's Jesus. And he lived with all of our unknowns. It says, that he grew from a child in wisdom and stature. So he grew. He didn't know everything right from the start. And just before his death, he commanded his disciples to remember him through the elements of the bread and the wine, eating and drinking. And then his work that he wanted them to carry on was to go and baptise the nations, making disciples of them, baptising them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So now you're probably thinking, well, you've given us an overview, but how does all this help with disunity? You started off with disunity. How does all this go together? Okay, let me try and tie it all together for you. We're going to look now at some of the words that he used. So many people have read this book, especially scholars, and they focused on the word hevel, or they focused on the theme of work or the theme of fearing God. Okay? But when you actually read the original Hebrew, you'll be surprised to see that this word kol, meaning all, everything, is actually mentioned over 80 times, which is pretty substantial for a word through not a greatly sized book. He uses it sometimes in relation to things and then sometimes in relation to people, okay? But he not only uses this word all, but he also uses inclusive language, okay? These other words that basically encompass everyone together. So he uses words such as humans, people, and anyone. And then he also, in relation to culture and things outside of the Israelite times, he uses this generic word for God, which is Elohim. And basically, that people would have been familiar with that term outside of the Jewish tradition or the Israelite tradition, because it was a term that people used often, okay? The Israelites would refer to God as Yahweh or Adonai because it was a more personalised term. But this word Elohim is a generic term for God that people in other religions, other cultures and around the Israelites would have been familiar with. So they could relate to it. Solomon presented a global perspective on life. His audience was from all over the world, and after hearing his wisdom, his audience went home to wherever they belonged from, and they took his wisdom home with them. They came to him for a reason, to get something, and they took it home with them, right? So what did they take home? They would have taken home that basically from this perspective, from this speech, humans are actually united in the fact that they are all created beings from God. They will all have the same fate, right? They would have taken home that all people experience this hevel, this fleetingness, this limitation of time. All people need to eat. We all need to drink. We all need to work to survive. All people have a basic set of common truths and a common desire for justice. Like, people would come to Solomon for that justice. They wanted to seek him for help for an issue that they couldn't solve on their own. They would come from miles and miles to resolve these issues, like the two widows and the child. They were all united in being under the sun. Throughout Ecclesiastes, Solomon uses that term under the sun so many times. It's a universal, all-encompassing phrase. And they would have taken home that all people need to reconcile with the fact that life is full of unknowns, that we don't have control over everything. Okay? There's almost this sense in Solomon's speech, and I'll half sing it for you, but it's like, we're all in this together. You know that song? It's like that all-encompassing, like, just, we're all in it together. All people are human. They share in these common human experiences. And all of these common human experiences, they outweigh all the differences that we have among each other. So Solomon's speech would have reminded people of their God-given unity in all their shared experiences under the sun. Just as Jesus later on also shared this idea. He said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, I don't know where we're at. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So by Solomon discussing all the shared experiences of our humanness, we can be reminded that this is the areas that we should actually focus on in life. We should focus on, we need to eat, we need to drink, we need to work to get those things, and we need to enjoy life together. And in that, because these things are gifts from God, we need to fear God in a way that is basically reflecting our love for all the things that He's given us. And when we experience the unknown, just remember that God has us in His hands. So as the church, we're called to love one another, right? We're called to love so that it will show out in the world that we are His disciples. As the body of Christ, the church is basically to provide a safe space, somewhere that people can come and be healed, somewhere that people can come and be guided by God, somewhere that people that can come and find a place that will share how God can sustain them and to show them how they can be reconciled with Him and with others. So Solomon was a gatherer of people, and people were drawn to him to hear his wisdom and his experiences. And many people that he went to see, he basically, because he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, he did a lot of negotiations, marriage-wise. And so he would have had to have learnt so many different cultures, right? There's so many negotiations that happen with a marriage, with a wedding to prepare. He would have observed all of their humanness. He had so many in-laws. Oh my goodness, how did he manage that all? He saw this and chose to accept all of them into his family. He, had that large dinner table for 1,000 people and obviously loved people. His palace had become a safe place, right? Somewhere that people could come to receive justice, that people could come to hear wisdom. He listened to people and he showed them empathy. Empathy is such a, sometimes a tricky thing, but also such a beautiful thing. And he, in his own way, without even knowing it, because Jesus came after his time, he sort of showed that love to people in the way that Jesus did. Jesus was not exclusive, he was inclusive. He invited everyone to his table. He went out to the most despised and welcomed them to eat with him. For his very last meal, he took the bread and wine as a symbol of his body and his blood, and he told the disciples to remember him. In his speech, Solomon states that eating and drinking are the necessities of life, and from the manna that God provided from heaven to the Israelites in the desert to the very like creative elements that we eat today, God provided it all. You know, he's provided the wheat. He's provided the vines. God has given us the gift of work to tend and to take care of these things that need growth. They need the time put into them to work and cultivate the soil and to then to harvest everything. And all of that work gives us the food that we need to sustain us. But in that work, there's a joy to it because it's a gift from God. God's given us this life. All right, so Solomon, even though he never had a chance to meet Jesus, he experienced God because he basically had a conversation with him to say, you know, what can I give you? And he said, well, I need wisdom to run this country. I need wisdom to, you know, help guide your people. With this wisdom came the knowledge that the simplest form of life is one that should not bring about argument, greed, or disunity, but rather something that should bring unity. Okay? In working together to gather, to share, to eat and drink together in fellowship, and just to be in the very presence of God, the Creator. As long as these people do these things, they could all know and experience the unknowingness of life together under the sun in this picture of unity together, experiencing it all in this togetherness. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion tonight that it takes only a second to, if you've read the New Testament, to see that the church has experienced disunity from the start. And basically there were divisions everywhere from usurpers of the truth, issues of status and honour around the communion table that in the book of Corinthians we read that basically some people didn't even make it to the communion meal because they were working so hard that they would come late, and by the time they came late all the food would have been gone, that they couldn't actually partake of the meal. It's sad, and I think that sometimes our churches today aren't much different in a way that I've seen people pretend to be so much higher than they are. We're all people. God loves us exactly the same. Okay, there's no status. We're all equal among each other. Okay, they make themselves feel higher so that they make others feel inferior. So much so that people feel unworthy to come to church in the first place, let alone get a glimpse at the communion table. Unfortunately, some of our churches are still devoid of diversity. Sorry, I'm probably touching on some pretty heavy topics right here, but not just in terms of race and gender and age and all of that sort of thing, but also in mental capabilities, okay? Some of our churches have excluded those with mental disabilities, those who are physically incapable of coming along because they're in a wheelchair and unable to speak. And unfortunately, some are filled with people with closed minds who are unwilling to open themselves up to anything different. Okay? I know this is heavy, I'm sorry, but this is where we're headed. Different, now there's a word. Even in this culture that is so accepting of everything under the sun, people still have a fear of different, okay? My eyes have been so open to this because my fourth son has been diagnosed with autism. And even though you look at him and he looks like a normal child, when people speak to him and he tries to speak back to them, they look at me like, what is he trying to say and what is wrong with him? Okay. I've had comments wherever I go to say, oh, that kid's not normal. What's wrong with him? He's not right. And there are many more words that have come out of mouths of people. And yes, these have been in churches and outside of churches. It's quite sad. Just people are scared of different, right? When they see that there's something not quite right, unfortunately, they decide to shut down. They don't try anymore. They just ignore him or judge his actions, or they look at me with this look that sort of feels like they're blaming me for who he is. But what they don't see is the absolute joy that I receive from being his mum. He has been one of the greatest gifts given to me, and he's opened up my eyes to see the world in such a different way, that different is beautiful, different is innocent, and different is joyful. And I think our churches are missing out so much when they don't accept people like this. Our fear of difference can actually cause disunity. So just for a moment, I know that it's heavy, but I want to think about who are we excluding from our pews? Where are the lonely widows attending? Where are the struggling addicts? Where are the struggling mental health people with other illnesses, other disabilities? And where are the homeless attending? How are we serving them as a church these days? Jesus went out of his way to be with these people, and unfortunately, not all the time is our churches doing this, because it's hard. It takes time, it takes effort, it's out of our control. But God is a relational being. He created us with a desire for community, to relate with others. And within his speech, Solomon described some relationships that were full of oppression, full of tears, full of foolishness, full of loneliness and envy and greed and slander. But he recognises that God's community was meant for loving relationships. His speech encouraged a universal community. That all of those who came into his palace, all of those who lived under the sun, he saw in a relatable way, right? He saw us all, we all experience the same. We all experience eating, drinking, fellowship, laughter, joy, togetherness, and united purpose. And we're all able to give praise and glory to God for the life that he's given us. In his own way, Solomon had become a light to the nations. He had become a beacon of wisdom for all who are under the sun to hear. Now let's come back to this thought of disunity. Disunity can be found in the smaller places, and at the very root is the heart response to when we encounter the unknown. Okay? So let me just ask a question. Who here likes to be in control? Just raise your hand. Control freaks in the room. Oh my gosh, no. I'm exactly the same. I like to be in control. Who likes to know everything that has happened or that will happen before it happens? Yeah. Who here has planned out the next 5 weeks in advance? 5 years? 10 years? Who has all their life planned out? And what happens in your heart when things don't quite go the way that you want, when you encounter the unknown? Do you know that you're not alone? That Solomon said in his speech, there is nothing new under the sun. Therefore, someone, somewhere, at some point, has experienced the things that you're going through. What a thought. To think that somewhere in some place of time, someone would have gone through some of the things that you've been through. Unexpected happens, but it's how we come through the other side of the unexpected that matters the most. Now, I'm going to get a bit personal with you tonight. I have experienced the unknown in my life. I have 4 beautiful boys, and in 2016 we went through a bit of a rough patch. Okay, I'm married with my husband. He's the most beautiful man. He's the most supportive man. He's great. But we went through a rough patch. Life was great. We were fully involved in a church for 15 years, running kids group, running the kids program on a Sunday, running a connect group at home where we had about 24 young children and 16 odd families in our house. Trying to squeeze them all in our house was pretty tight, but we got there. I was running a mums group and just serving in lots of different things, attending church about 3 to 4 times a week and working part-time. It was busy, but it was good. Then the unknown happened, the unexpected. My 3rd son at the time was just jumping around, falling in the backyard with his brother, and his brother ended up landing on his leg on the trampoline and broke his leg. 35 weeks pregnant. I carried him into the emergency section of the Women's and Children's Hospital, and they didn't actually realise I was pregnant, so they told me to wait. Stand there holding my quite heavy 3-year-old at that time while I'm 35 weeks pregnant. And broken through both bones. We were very lucky that he didn't have to have any surgery or anything, so he got through that. 2 weeks later, basically my second son told me that his neck was sore. And then each day from that time, I would take him to the doctors saying, actually, it's getting bigger. There was like a bit of a lump forming. And they were like, oh, it's just glandular fever. And I'm like, but he is, 6 years old? I don't think 6-year-old boys get glandular fever. This is not right. Just as a mother, I knew something wasn't right. Continued to take him to the doctor each week until he basically ended up vomiting blood, which is pretty horrible. Took him to the emergency section and he almost died. And he had a infection between his spinal cord and his airways. Which is apparently something that children just get randomly. And we were fortunate enough that God was good and he did survive. So a few weeks after that, my nan, who was very close to, passed away. And then we basically had my 4th son 2 weeks early and almost lost him at birth because the cord was wrapped around his neck 5 times. So let's just say it was a very full-on season. And then my eldest son basically was being bullied at school and he got pushed off the playground and broke his arm. So we had this within the space of about 3 months. It was unknown, unexpected. Like no one would have ever imagined the things that we'd just been through. Running the mums group in that, I had a woman with severe postnatal depression come to me, and basically that ended in, she did become a Christian and it ended well, but the actual situation itself was very heavy. And we had 3 family members suffering with depression at the same time, and us being the constant, stable people that we are, they all came to us. So it was a very heavy season with all this other stuff going on and then people coming to us, and we're still trying to serve and still trying to do our jobs and everything else. You can imagine how snowed under I felt. So I decided, okay, we've got to look after ourselves now. I need to pull back. I need to stop serving. And in that time when I stopped serving and pulled back, Unfortunately, the church that we were in didn't understand why, because they didn't understand what was happening around us. Even though I had clearly explained what was happening, they just didn't accept that as a reason for pulling back. And so we experienced rejection. Needless to say, after all this happening and not having a breather, I went and sought counselling just so that I could have a minute and space to process everything individually to get through that time. It was unknown. I got to experience this feeling of hevel, this feeling of fleetingness, this vapour of life, this meaninglessness of things that happen that I just didn't understand why they were happening. And then I finally came to the understanding that, and the realisation that I'm comfortable with not knowing everything. I don't need to know everything because I know that God's got me in his hands. I'm okay with not being God because there's so many big decisions that I don't want to have anything to do with that. I'll just leave that to you, God. That's fine. I don't need to be God because he already is. I finally believe that God loved me just as I am, and as I bring all that I am and all the unknowingness of my human limitation to Jesus, Jesus says, I know, I've been there, I've experienced it, and you're not alone. There's someone out there who in some space or time has experienced the things that we've been through, and you're not alone. So this whirlwind of life ended in disunity in my church and myself because they couldn't understand what was happening and why I needed to pull back. It was a human reaction to a human experience of the unknown. So from this experience, I just can't help to think, well, maybe Solomon's words could have helped us. Everyone, we all experience life under the sun. Nothing is new. All of our lives are fleeting, so why waste them on disputes? We're all in this life together. Solomon's beacon of light shines in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's unifying in all its words. Everyone under the sun. His words evangelised to the nations around him in a gentle way that showed empathy towards the others. He saw that from good and bad, from fun to things that lacked meaning, we're all united in some way because we're all created beings by God. We're not that much different from each other. All the nations are the same. We're all filled with people that serve a God, even idols for gods with no names. Solomon used the generic word Elohim and to relate to these people, and he recognised that he was the wisest man on earth at that point of time, but he gave credit to say that there are other wise people at that time as well who could help. His words gently evangelised, causing people to recognise the creator of all things. He acknowledged the giver of the gifts of life, and he gently urged people to fear the creator of the food and the drink that sustain us, and to keep his commands, for this is the duty of all mankind. So if we're all in this life together, if nothing is new under the sun, if we begin to learn from his wisdom and begin to become comfortable with our own human limitations and the experience of the unknown, I wonder that if we come to the place where we can reconcile the limitation of who we are as humans with our Creator, then maybe we would be able to see unity in our relationships and our churches come back again. Unity and love that would make church a place that when people look in, they would want to come in. I wonder if sharing the words of Solomon, sharing his wisdom given to him for all, would make a difference in the world, and if Solomon's words written in his speech could remind people of God's given unity in their shared experiences under the sun. By discussing shared experiences of our humanness, we can become reminded of what we should focus on in life: to eat, drink and enjoy our work whilst fearing God, being reminded that we're all human, we all have limitations, none of us can see the future, none of us live forever, none of us are in control of everything, and therefore we need to be more accepting of one another and our limitations. Now, I just wanted to come around a time of reflection before we go and have some supper, so after the break, basically, we're going to go into groups and discuss a few things. I know that it's been a lot to take in, and maybe you think, wow, I've never heard this take on Ecclesiastes before, but I just want you to go into a time of reflection at the moment and think, well, maybe, is there any disunity in my life at the moment? Is there any unknown that I'm experiencing that I need to deal with at the moment? And basically, just reflect on everything that's been said and just take a moment for yourself. I'm going to sing a song now, which is one that I wrote when I was going through all of this stuff. So just take a few minutes to, just think on everything that you've just heard and think about any unknown or disunity or anything that you need to deal with in your own lives first, or perhaps, in the future. All right. So this session we're going to basically get into some groups and discuss a bit of our unknown together. Maybe a few of the experiences and things that have been difficult. Maybe a bit of the essence of being human. And I just want you also to discuss whether you've ever heard this take on Ecclesiastes. It would be nice to hear your thoughts and response on this take. This is actually something that I'm working on. So I'm doing a Masters of Theology at the moment. So this is my to do with my thesis around this topic. And I've only just started, so I haven't fully done all my research and stuff, but it's getting there and it's coming together. And so some of your feedback I would love to actually hear and maybe perhaps use in some of my research later on. So, this part, we'll just, all right. So, we're all in life together. Nothing is new under the sun. So I wonder if we learn from Solomon's wisdom to become comfortable with our human limitations and experiencing the unknown, whether we could come to reconcile with the limitations of who we are as humans and the way that God has made us as this, whether we would be able to see unity in relationships and the churches again, unity and love, because we're more accepting of those experiences and things that we don't necessarily know are going to happen. We don't know our futures. So I wonder if sharing Solomon's words would just help us be more accepting of each other and bring a unity. If we think about life in the simplest of terms, in eating, drinking, and enjoying our work whilst fearing God, could it help us come to terms with the facts that we all experience this unknowing and be comforted by the fact that we're held in God's hands when it happens? Could we learn to listen to others? Sometimes that's really hard. I know a lot of people who don't like to listen, they just like to talk. So could we learn to listen? Could we learn to show empathy? Sometimes empathy doesn't come naturally to us because we're not personally wired that way, but we can all show it when we come to listen and understand where that person's coming from. Could we be willing to become vulnerable with those who are around us, and could we be open to share the experiences of unknown? Could we be open to share that we're not perfect? Sometimes the church seems a little bit pious out there to the people on the other side. Could we become vulnerable and tell them, actually, we're not perfect, we're working through this together, we're all struggling with the same issues? Could we openly share the hope that we have that help us through these unknown times with others? And could we spark a hope in those around us from doing so? And then in turn start seeing some unity in our relationships and in our families, in our churches and in the wider communities. So this unity that I talk about, this unity that would be nice to see, is a unity that joins us together as we understand what we all experience. It is the ever-repeating human condition. It is the knowing that we all have limitations. We are all limited in our knowledge. We are all limited in what we have control over. We're all limited in experiencing the environment around us. We all do not know the future, nor the events of life and chance around us. We all need to eat, to drink, to work. We all will die one day. It's a fact of life. And we all, no matter what happens, are held by God in his hands. So fear God, obey his commands to love one another. You see, I believe that the word of God is a double-edged sword. It's ready to cut through the hardest of hearts and cleanse it back to its original purpose, designed by our Creator. In Romans 12, verse 15, it says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn." That's where the empathy comes in. Genuine empathy, heart changes, united minds. Can we bring that unity and meaning back into our churches that would allow all those who look inside to long for the unity that we have together? All right, so that's an overview of what we've just talked about, right? So now I'd love you to break into groups, and you can stay on your tables or you can mix and mingle. Ideally, groups of 3, I think, is probably a good size, or 4. And I just want you to discuss the following questions. Have you ever experienced a time of unknown and the essence of being human? How were you able to reconcile with this feeling of unknowingness? Did this experience make you consider others in a new way? Did it make you more accepting of the people in the situation? Have you ever considered Ecclesiastes as a speech made by Solomon? And have you ever seen the theme of unity? Has unity ever come to you as an application? And the last one, thinking about unity as an application, do you feel you could use it to help your congregation, your family, your community to gain a new perspective and attitude towards others? And do you think unity could be achieved in the church with recognition of all of our commonalities under the sun? So I think if we break into the groups for about 10 minutes, maybe write down a few things that you are willing to share back to me. I would love to write those down, get some of your responses to the message and things. And then, we'll just see what everyone comes up with. Is that okay? Yep, good. All right. So I'm going to write them down on this little board. So if you are willing to share, that would be great. I've had some really good discussions and things, and I'm sure you've all had good discussions in your group. So I'll just go from group to group, and if someone could mention something from each, that would be wonderful. Probably particularly in regards to, first of all, whether you've ever heard this perspective before. I'd like to know those questions, and then maybe mentioning just something that you got out of this as well. Yeah. All right, we'll start with this side here, ladies. Put you on the spot.
Our group have never heard your approach before. It seems a very new, original and encouraging approach
Good. Yeah.
to accept that Solomon's wisdom was and is all-encompassing and inclusive of every type of human experience. So we enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Cool. Is there something, sorry, just if we maybe just keep the mic with her for the moment. Is there something that, like, you guys discussed that you wanted to share in particular?
About Ecclesiastes?
Yeah.
No, it was quite new to me, so...
Yeah. Anything that you're going to take home from it?
sorry, yeah, go on. No, go on.
We're not.
We're just arguing.
It's a speech.
Yeah, we were really, none of us in our wisdom of age had actually looked at this as a speech.
Okay,
And we're
yep.
all going home at some stage to read it aloud to
Yep.
ourselves to see. The thing that we talked about a fair bit was that that sense of nothing that's happened to us, and there's a variety of things that have happened to us through our lives, that thought that there's someone else has been there before.
Yeah.
And we took that to the point when we were talking about how often that may not be said to you, but when somebody comes alongside of you in a time of crisis or deep challenge,
Yeah.
Even a hug, even the statement of, I don't really quite understand where you are,
Yeah.
but I'm going home to pray for you, is a reflection of that fact that there's unity in all of that.
Yeah.
Okay, that was
Good.
about where we got.
Thank you. That's great. Chris, this table.
None of us had, thought of this from a unity perspective before, so that was new to us. We really appreciated it.
Good.
One of the key things that we talked about was, in our experiences, our various experiences of the unknown, it has led to a sense of empathy towards others.
Yep.
One of the key takeaways that I thought was really good was it brings a freedom in not needing to change others.
Yeah, that's great. Good one.
So thanks to the table for their wisdom. Yeah.
Okay, back group.
No, I'm worn out my talking, so.
I feel like if I look away, people like give me the microphone.
I'll get you back, Chris. Yes, I don't know if I can talk to what was discussed there, because it was not really on the questions, I didn't think. Would that be fair? Would that be fair? I haven't heard that take at all, and I'm interested in it. I'd say that I have read Ecclesiastes through a few times. It's a book that does, I do sort of resonate, or whatever the clever words are to say about it. But I always imagined it was sort of more of a lonely type thing. Again, that's just reading it, not studying. I haven't studied it to any degree. So, but having heard you say that makes it worthwhile to then consider a different approach, because even if I don't either like it or agree with it, you do need to actually have a look at it in that way. So I think that's an interesting idea. What other useful things? Is there anything else? You're not helping me. I need preparation for this sort of thing, so that's it.
Sorry to put you on the spot. This front group here. Yeah.
You want me to talk? Yeah. Okay. What do we want to say? What was? I would feel like if I'm talking, I feel like I want to hear what was important to the rest of the group. But just tell me, yeah, because you were taking some notes.
Oh, the bit where we discussed how that, I think age, our table was quite varied in age, and I think something that I took from it was the different perspective that you can read or take from Ecclesiastes depending on where you are in your life journey, I suppose. Like particularly with that third question where it says, did it make you consider others in a new way? Yes, I could really relate to that. Whereas Michaela was like, oh, I sort of found that more helpful for myself. And if I look back at myself, perhaps at your age, then I would have had exactly the same feeling or learning from it, I suppose. So, yeah, I found that a bit interesting, just that how it's looked at differently the older we get.
Cool.
The other thing that we talked about was, where is it, the question? The essence of being human, that is experiencing the unknown. And I said that I think that it can be isolating to experience the unknown on your own, but it can be uniting to experience the unknown with other people. And a great example of that, while it was not a positive thing, COVID was something that everybody experienced. No matter who you are, where you are, everybody experienced that unknown of what was going to happen, what was going on, were we going to be even, everybody sort of felt unsafe and frightened. But there was a comfort in, I think, everybody feeling that together.
Yeah, that's really good. Cool. Just back table there.
Barry, you say what you did.
We started with the last question first about commonality.
Oh, beautiful, yep.
And we think here at Unley it is really good. We think we work together very well, all headed in the same direction.
Yep.
And over the years, when you spoke earlier about people with disabilities and so forth, we've had a range of people here
Great.
who I think have fitted in. Some have been very funny and been a few answers back to the preacher when he's been preaching, so it's really put that little bit of interest in the sermon.
That's good.
But it's been really good, and we think we've achieved that over the years.
Yeah, that's
so,
great.
it's good.
Really good to hear. Yeah. Very good. Anything else from that table?
We had some thoughts about how commonality could help us achieve unity. One of the thoughts was about there's no need to portray something that's not true. There's no need to sort of pretend that things are better than they are. if
Yeah.
everybody acknowledges that they have the same life and the same things and subject to the same fate and those kinds of things. So it can break down our need to have a facade. And then the other one was that it can break down our tendency to judge. So, like, as you sort of experience with your son, people sort of judging you because of him. If we accept that these things are common to all of us, then there's a whole lot less likelihood to say, well, that's obviously your fault, or it must have been something you'd done, or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
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 We kind of touched on, as a predominantly young adults group, kind of the discussions that we had in our study when we did it, and kind of a common theme that we all connected with was we very much exclusively viewed it as a personal piece, so something that you could use and read to inform yourself and your life. And I think what we kind of gathered from tonight, reflecting on it, is we didn't leave with a collective feeling of recognition, but when we spoke in a group and we read the different things, everyone was affirming each other and going, yes, like, I agree with you, I've experienced this. But I think a step that we maybe needed to take, which I think you've presented a really great perspective on, is recognising that it was a collective experience, you know, instead of viewing it just in isolation of, oh, I've experienced this and how great that I can lean on someone who's experienced this as well. I suppose just focusing on, you know, really collecting with that idea that, you know, it is an experience of everyone together, and, you know, what a great blessing that we can share in these experiences of life together.
Yeah, that's good. Very good. Anyone else want to say anything? All good. All right. Well, sorry for my very messy writing. This thing is very difficult to work. But that's really, really good feedback in hearing how you guys have all perceived tonight's view on Ecclesiastes. I just wanted to take the time now just to end on prayer. That's the best way to end the night, isn't it, really? And just to thank you all for being open and honest and sharing with each other and just thinking about things in a new way tonight. So, all right, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you for the conversations that we've shared. Thank you for the word that you've shared and the new thoughts that have been placed on our minds because of it. Thank you for the encouragement and the affirmation that comes through being together and talking about things, Lord God. I pray that it would continue to happen in churches around, that we would learn to accept one another and encourage one another the way that your word tells us to do. So we thank you for tonight, and please be with us as we go into the rest of our week. Amen.